thank you for the invitation, Mr. Guarnieri, and thank you, Mr. Hoven, for taking time out from your divinical studies to share your latest thoughts with us. I'm not here to defend the theory of evolution. I'm here to present a little bit of the evidence that supports the theory. It is supported by an overwhelming number of scientists, contrary to what Mr. Guarnieri has already asserted. Now, I'm going to talk on fossils and I'm going to talk on genetics. I want to talk on fossils for the first 15 minutes because I believe they're the key to the subject. If there were no fossils at all, I'm not sure we would be here today. I'm sure that it would have taken Darwin a good bit longer to figure out a theory of evolution. Imagine that creatures happened to just vaporize when they died, so they left no traces at all. That's just a property of life, and we're aware of it. We know that we don't expect fossils, but still, there's an absence of evidence from the past that's disturbing. Well, that's not the case. Creatures don't vaporize when they die, and they often leave imprints which get covered up and are maintained over long periods of time. Now, you may not know or guess how many fossils have been discovered in the last 150, 200 years, but there are well over 100 billion fossils that have been discovered. There is one fossil field in which it's estimated there's 80 billion vertebrate fossils alone. There are tens of millions of fossils that have been cataloged, described, dug up, and deposited in museums and similar institutions around the world, and they've been studied. Whatever else you want to say about evolutionists, they haven't been lazy, they've been doing their work. Now, what does this huge fossil record tell us? It tells us several important things. First of all, it tells us that 99.9% of all species are extinct. That is, the fossil record largely consists of creatures that are not existing today, that have no counterpart today, but are different kinds of creatures, dinosaurs, for example. Okay, so for every one species today, there were 1,000 that went extinct. Furthermore, the fossil record, you know, I'm wondering if this thing is causing the feedback here. Oh, okay. There's a little bit of kind of feedback loop here. Anyway, if you look at the fossils, they're organized vertically, with, as we understand it, the top layers being more recently deposited than the deeper layers. And with some exceptions, of course, the general rule is that simpler, more congruent, and smaller species are located lower down in the fossil record. By congruent, I mean species that fall in between species that you would find today, for example. So you can go back, and I'll tell you about dating in a moment, to about 150 million years ago, and you find that mammals converge on a mammal-like reptile. If you take all land vertebrates, they converge to a fish that resembles a coelacanth, a lobe-finned fish. Now, the third thing that's worth mentioning is its same pattern is found the world over, again with exceptions, but you can line up strata in Australia, you can line up strata in Europe, you can line up strata in North America, and you find similar sets of creatures as you go down similar levels. Now, this pattern alone, with no other argumentation, suggests at once evolution through time, because you expect creatures to begin small, simple, and congruent. You expect higher strata to be more recently deposited. You expect creatures to become more complex over time, to increase in average size over time, and to diverge, which is exactly what the fossil record shows. Now, in addition, we have a completely independent system for timing these fossils. And this is dating the systems that's been developed by geologists based on chemistry and physics. And has to do with the radioactive decay of unstable isotopes. So, for example, carbon-14 is produced, we know, in the outer atmosphere, It is taken up by living creatures, but it decays. However, in the living creature, it reaches a steady state because it's continually taking in new carbon-14, and these steady states are well studied. When it dies, it no longer takes in any calcium-14. The calcium-14 in it just decays, and it decays, so far as we know, at a steady rate. Calcium-14 is only good back to about 50,000 years. It has a half-life of about 5,500 years. Now, at the other extreme, you have potassium-argon, which has a half-life of about 1 billion years and is good for timing events from 100,000 years right on back to 1 billion, more than 1 billion. You have dozens of other chemical systems which have intermediate time scales over which they work well, and you have overlap among these systems, and you can look to see whether your dating systems give you congruent results. And they do indeed. It is not true if you use carbon-14 and another method that's also good for 50,000 years that you get divergent results. You get congruent results. So we have some confidence that we're able to date these strata, and we also show through the dating that the assumption that more higher up deposits are more recently deposited show less decay. The system even works for tree rings. There are trees that are 4,000 or 5,000 years old and whose age can be counted by rings, and by which you can check to see whether carbon-14, for example, is working. Now, at the time of Darwin, there was a sufficient fossil record so that devout Christians who were also serious scientists had to imagine 20 separate creations followed by 19 obliterations, the most recent creation being the one we're living in order to make it consistent with a simple-minded reading of certain sections of the Bible. After a while, it becomes easier to imagine that God lets the world evolve than to put him or her to the work of continually creating and saying, oops, I got that slightly wrong, destroy the whole thing, start over. You'd have to have tens of thousands of separate creations and one less obliteration to fit the data according to this theory. Now along comes this character, and he says, hey, I can solve this. What about the flood? So he imagines that the flood miraculously killed off the earlier creatures. Apparently Noah violated instructions because he discriminated against dinosaurs and other creatures with nostrils, didn't allow them on the ark. And then in one marvelous swirl, somehow deposited these dead creatures in this highly organized pattern we see repeated the world over. Now, this violates expectation if you think about these dead creatures swirling around in this dreadful flood. You'd expect heavier creatures to fall deeper, for example. You don't. The heaviest mammals are right at the top. The dinosaurs are 150 million years old. They're not way down there at the bottom at, say, 500 million. So this view is absurd on its face in just trying to describe the actual evidence we have on the existence of fossils. But matters only get worse if you take this thing seriously, and that's what scientists do, and they do calculations. So they say, okay, you